Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of history's least relaxing moments. So naturally, we're going to make it as relaxing as possible. Find a comfortable spot. Pull the blanket a little higher. Maybe dim the lights if you haven't already. If you're listening in bed, congratulations. You have chosen a much better century than the people we're about to visit. Their healthcare consisted of optimistic prayers, suspicious herbs, and neighbors confidently recommending treatments that absolutely did not work. Tonight we're drifting back to Europe in the middle of the 14th century, where the world's most infamous disease quietly walked into town and immediately made everyone's week much, much worse. But instead of focusing on battles, gore, or terrifying details, we're going to wander through the everyday lives of ordinary people trying to survive without hospitals, antibiotics, or any real understanding of germs. We'll look at what they believed, what they feared, what actually helped, and the wonderfully creative ways humans tried to solve impossible problems. Because when you don't know bacteria exist, almost every explanation sounds reasonable. So settle in, breathe slowly, and let's travel back to a world where the greatest medical advice available often came from a man who believed your personality was controlled by the amount of yellow bile inside your body. Not exactly the Mayo Clinic. Picture Europe around the year 1347. Most people had never traveled farther than a day's walk from where they were born. Their entire world was a collection of fields, a village church, perhaps a local market, and roads that were muddy whenever it rained and dusty whenever it didn't. Life was already difficult. Most families worked from sunrise until sunset. Crops failed often enough to keep everyone humble. Winters could be cruel. Food was unpredictable. Clean water was not always easy to find. Childhood was dangerous long before disease arrived. Even something as ordinary as a small infected cut could quietly become fatal. Yet despite all of this, people adapted remarkably well. Humans have always been very good at getting used to difficult circumstances. If your grandfather survived 3 famines, your father survived 2 wars, and your neighbor once lost an argument with a cow, everyday hardship simply became part of life. Nobody expected comfort. They expected survival. Medicine reflected this reality. The average medieval physician was educated according to ideas that had been passed down from ancient Greece and Rome. The most influential authority was the Greek physician Galen, whose medical theories remained respected for more than 1,000 years. According to Galen, the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, phlegm. Health depended on keeping these fluids balanced. Too much blood? Problem. Too much black bile? Also a problem. Too much phlegm? Apparently your body had become overly enthusiastic about mucus. To modern ears, it sounds unusual. To medieval doctors, it explained nearly everything. If someone became sick, the answer was usually restoring balance. This could involve changes in diet, special drinks, herbal mixtures, bloodletting, or carefully timed purging. Because if balance was good, then removing things from the body somehow seemed logical. Again, medical science still had several centuries left before discovering microbes. Most illnesses were mysteries. Even professional doctors often worked from educated guesses. And educated guesses can remain guesses for a surprisingly long time. Meanwhile, ordinary villagers relied on practical experience. Grandmothers collected herbs. Monks copied medical manuscripts. Local healers memorized generations of remedies. Some treatments genuinely helped. Willow bark contained compounds related to aspirin. Honey slowed bacterial growth in wounds. Certain herbs eased pain or digestive problems. Nobody understood exactly why. They simply noticed that sometimes these remedies worked. Human observation can be surprisingly accurate even without scientific explanations. Then came the ships. The Black Death did not appear everywhere at once. It traveled. Merchant vessels crossed the Mediterranean carrying spices, silk, grain, wool, and very unwelcome passengers. Today we know infected fleas living on black rats played an important role in spreading plague bacteria in many outbreaks. The people unloading cargo had no idea. To them, the ships looked completely ordinary. Perhaps a little delayed. Perhaps the crew looked tired. Nothing especially alarming. At first. Then sailors began dying. Dockworkers became ill. Families noticed strange fevers. Neighbors stopped appearing at church. Suddenly entire households disappeared from daily life. Confusion spread almost as quickly as disease. Imagine hearing rumors from another town. Something terrible had happened. Nobody knew exactly what. Some said poisoned wells. Others blamed unusual weather. Others believed strange stars had appeared in the heavens. Astrology carried enormous influence. If planets aligned incorrectly, perhaps they had corrupted the air itself. It sounds unusual now. But remember, if nobody has discovered bacteria yet, looking toward the sky isn't much stranger than looking anywhere else. People searched desperately for explanations. The human brain dislikes uncertainty. Even incorrect answers often feel more comforting than having none. Soon another theory became popular. Bad air. Miasma. The belief that foul smells cause disease had existed for centuries. Rotting matter smelled unpleasant. Sick neighborhoods often smelled unpleasant. Therefore, surely the smell itself caused illness. Reasonable enough without microscopes. So people fought unpleasant smells with impressive determination. They carried flowers. Burned incense. Filled homes with fragrant herbs. Walked around holding scented cloths beneath their noses. Doctors recommended pleasant aromas. Wealthier families purchased expensive perfumes. Churches filled with incense. Markets sold aromatic plants. Lavender. Rosemary. Sage. Mint. Juniper. Some households constantly burned wood or herbs indoors. Did pleasant smells stop plague? Not directly. But a few accidental benefits existed. Smoke occasionally discouraged insects. Certain herbs repelled fleas to a small degree. Improved ventilation sometimes reduced indoor crowding. Not because anyone understood transmission. Just because fresh air seemed healthier. Sometimes incorrect theories accidentally encouraged mildly useful habits. History enjoys irony like that. As fear increased, cities attempted something entirely new. Isolation. At first, nobody called it quarantine. The word itself came later from the Italian quaranta, meaning 40. The idea developed gradually. If newcomers seemed connected to sickness, perhaps keep them outside the city for a while. Just to see what happened. Venice became particularly innovative. As one of Europe's busiest trading centers, ships constantly arrived from distant ports. Closing trade completely would cripple the economy. Allowing unrestricted entry risked catastrophe. So officials experimented. Incoming vessels sometimes waited offshore before unloading. Passengers remained separated. Goods stayed aboard. Was it inconvenient? Very. Did merchants complain? Constantly. Merchants have remained wonderfully consistent across the centuries. But surprisingly, this cautious waiting period occasionally worked. Without understanding bacteria, medieval officials had stumbled onto one of history's most effective public health measures. Not perfect. Not foolproof. But genuinely helpful. One of the greatest weapons against plague appeared before anyone knew exactly what they were fighting. Elsewhere, villages improvised. Some communities blocked roads. Others refused visitors. Travelers found gates locked. Strangers were viewed with growing suspicion. Hospitality quietly gave way to caution. A difficult emotional shift. For generations, welcoming travelers had been considered virtuous. Now strangers carried invisible danger. People had to choose between kindness and survival. Many chose survival. Hard to blame them. Families also changed daily routines. If someone inside the household became ill, relatives often separated sleeping spaces when possible. Not because they understood infection. Simply because people noticed sickness sometimes spread among those living closely together. Observation once again pointed them toward useful behavior. Many medieval people were remarkably practical. They lacked scientific language. They did not lack common sense. Of course, not every response was helpful. Some believed loud noises purified the air. Others rang church bells continuously. Still others fired cannons into the sky. Apparently, if terrible smells caused disease, perhaps explosions could scatter the bad air. It sounds dramatic. It also accomplished very little besides alarming nearby livestock. The cows were probably not impressed. Religious life became central. Church attendance increased. People confessed sins. Communities organized processions. Special prayers spread across Europe. Many sincerely believed the plague represented divine punishment. If God had allowed disease, perhaps repentance might end it. Faith provided emotional stability. Even when medicine failed, religion gave structure. People could still pray. Still gather. Still hope. Hope matters. Especially when answers do not exist. Monasteries often cared for the sick despite enormous personal risk. Monks and nuns remained beside patients when others fled. Some survived. Many did not. Yet they continued helping. Quiet acts of compassion rarely dominate history books. They deserve remembering. Meanwhile, ordinary mothers continued cooking. Children still needed feeding. Animals still required care. Fields still demanded attention. Life refused to pause completely. That may be one of history's most remarkable patterns. Even during catastrophe, someone is still baking bread. Someone is repairing shoes. Someone is arguing about property lines. Someone is complaining that the weather has ruined this year's onions. Daily life stubbornly continues. People adapted in countless small ways. Markets became quieter. Families exchanged goods across greater distances. Conversations happened through windows instead of doorways. Some villages delayed celebrations. Others cancelled fairs. Crowded gatherings slowly decreased in places hit hardest. Again, nobody fully understood why crowds increased danger. They simply noticed patterns. Patterns save lives. Long before science explains them. The wealthy responded differently whenever possible. Noble families often left cities entirely. Country estates suddenly became very fashionable. Fresh air. Open fields. Fewer neighbors. Less exposure. It wasn't guaranteed safety. But population density mattered. Without realizing it, many wealthy households reduced their chances simply by spreading farther apart. Poorer families usually had no such option. They remained where work existed. Small homes became crowded. Several generations often shared limited space. Disease spread more easily. History frequently reminds us that wealth influences survival. Even 600 years ago, doctors themselves became recognizable figures. Long robes. Gloves. Walking staffs. Though the famous bird-like plague masks most people imagine actually became common much later than the first Black Death. Popular imagination likes combining different centuries together. History politely sighs every time this happens. Real 14th-century physicians looked much less theatrical. And considerably more exhausted. They visited patient after patient. Recommended herbs. Checked pulses. Examined urine. Consulted astrology. Suggested dietary changes. Sometimes they helped. Often they couldn't. Imagine carrying years of education only to discover your knowledge has reached its limits. That must have been heartbreaking. Many physicians stayed anyway. Professional duty mattered deeply. Even when success remained painfully uncertain. For ordinary people, survival often depended upon something much simpler. Luck. Not satisfying. Not heroic. But true. Some individuals became exposed yet never fell seriously ill. Others recovered. Some villages escaped relatively lightly while neighboring communities suffered terribly. Modern genetics, immunity, environment, nutrition, flea populations, and countless variables all played roles. Medieval people simply called it fortune. Or providence. Or God's mercy. Different words. Same mystery. One fascinating survival strategy involved cleanliness. Now, medieval hygiene has acquired an unfortunate reputation. Popular culture loves pretending everyone wandered around permanently coated in mud. Reality was more complicated. People washed. Not as frequently as today. Not with antibacterial soap. But they valued cleanliness more than stereotypes suggest. Public bathhouses existed in many cities before plague outbreaks. Hands were washed before meals. Clothing was cleaned when possible. Fresh linen was appreciated. Soap existed. Water existed. People were not entirely strangers to either. Ironically, after plague fears increased, some public bathhouses became less popular because crowded spaces appeared risky. Sometimes fear discouraged practices that might otherwise have helped. History rarely moves in perfectly logical directions. As night settled over medieval towns, candles flickered inside homes where families quietly wondered what tomorrow might bring. No television distracted them. No internet updated statistics. Only rumors. Church bells. Footsteps outside. And hope that another morning would arrive peacefully. For many people. It did. For others. History took a different path. And as we continue our journey, we'll discover that surviving the Black Death was rarely about finding one miraculous cure. Instead, it was about hundreds of tiny decisions, accidental discoveries, community cooperation, stubborn resilience, and an extraordinary ability to keep living in a world that suddenly made much less sense. So for now, leave the little village sleeping beneath its thatched roofs, with herbs hanging beside the doors, smoke drifting gently into the evening air, and families quietly believing that tomorrow, just maybe, would be a little kinder than today. And sometimes, that hope alone was enough to help people face another sunrise. When we left our little medieval village, evening had settled over the rooftops. Candles flickered behind tiny windows. Somewhere a dog barked at absolutely nothing, which dogs have continued doing with impressive consistency throughout history. A few people were saying quiet prayers before bed. Others were checking on elderly relatives. And somewhere, a village healer was probably grinding herbs together while looking far more confident than anyone really had a right to be. Tonight, let's wander into the fascinating world of medieval medicine. Because when the Black Death arrived, people did not simply sit down and wait for fate. They experimented. Constantly. Some of those experiments were surprisingly sensible. Others were, well, based on the kind of logic that only makes sense if you've never heard the word bacteria. Which, to be fair, nobody had. So before we laugh too much at medieval medicine, it's worth remembering something. If you suddenly found yourself transported back to the year 1348 with no modern equipment, no laboratory, no pharmacy, and no internet, which, for some people, would somehow be the hardest loss, you probably wouldn't do much better. Knowing that germs exist is one thing. Actually treating plague without antibiotics is another entirely. So let's be kind to our medieval doctors. They were trying to solve one of history's greatest medical mysteries while working almost completely in the dark. The first thing that surprises many people is just how much medieval physicians actually studied. Popular culture often imagines them as random old men mixing mysterious liquids while muttering dramatic phrases. Reality was far more organized. A university-trained physician spent years learning. He studied ancient medical texts. He memorized theories from Hippocrates and Galen. He learned about anatomy, although opportunities to study the human body directly were limited. He practiced identifying illnesses through observation. He examined urine. He checked a patient's pulse. He asked detailed questions about sleep, appetite, mood, and digestion. In many ways, he was following a recognizable medical process. The problem wasn't laziness. The problem was that the entire framework rested on incorrect assumptions. Imagine trying to build the world's greatest telescope while believing the moon was made of cheese. You might become incredibly skilled at polishing lenses. Your conclusion would still have problems. That was medieval medicine. Highly intelligent people. Working from the wrong instruction manual. The four humors still ruled nearly every diagnosis. Blood represented warmth and moisture. Yellow bile symbolized heat and dryness. Black bile brought coldness and melancholy. Phlegm reflected coldness and moisture. Every illness meant something had fallen out of balance. So restoring balance became the doctor's mission. If someone had a fever, perhaps the body contained too much heat. Cooling foods might help. If someone appeared sluggish, warming spices could be recommended. Food itself was considered medicine. This wasn't entirely unreasonable. Even modern doctors know nutrition matters enormously. Medieval physicians simply extended the idea much further. Every meal carried medical significance. Chicken broth was recommended for some illnesses. Certain fruits were encouraged. Others avoided. Wine appeared in countless treatments. Mostly because medieval Europeans found reasons to include wine in almost everything. Breakfast? Wine. Dinner? Wine. Medicine? Believe it or not. Also wine. At least it made some herbal mixtures easier to swallow. Herbs filled nearly every medieval home. Not because people enjoyed gardening. Because plants genuinely mattered. Lavender soothed anxiety. Mint settled upset stomachs. Chamomile encouraged sleep. Rosemary was believed to strengthen memory. Sage appeared in dozens of remedies. Thyme helped with coughs. Garlic was praised almost everywhere. Modern science has confirmed that several of these herbs do contain useful compounds. No, they could not cure plague. But they sometimes relieved symptoms. And when no cure exists, symptom relief becomes incredibly valuable. Imagine having a persistent fever. A warm herbal tea cannot eliminate the disease. But if it eases discomfort even slightly, you treasure it. Comfort is not the same as cure. Yet comfort matters. Especially during long illnesses. One of the most famous medieval treatments involved something called a theriac. Theriac was less a medicine and more a grand collection of ingredients assembled with tremendous optimism. Some recipes contained dozens of components. Others contained more than 100. Herbs. Spices. Honey. Roots. Flowers. Tree resins. sometimes even powdered minerals. Preparing theriac could take weeks. It was expensive, complicated, and widely respected. Doctors prescribed it for poison, fevers, infections, and countless other ailments. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a miracle supplement advertised at 2 in the morning. If someone claimed it cured everything, history suggests a healthy amount of skepticism. Still, many ingredients probably had mild medicinal effects. Not because the recipe itself possessed magical powers. Because some plants naturally contain useful chemicals. The real star ingredient was often hope. Hope has always been medicine's faithful companion. Sometimes patients improved because their immune systems were already fighting successfully. The medicine received the credit. Humans remain wonderfully enthusiastic about confusing coincidence with causation. Bloodletting deserves its famous reputation. Unfortunately, if a physician believed excess blood contributed to illness, removing some seemed logical. So patients sometimes had blood drawn using small knives or leeches. The amount depended upon the doctor's judgment. Today we know plague patients needed supportive care, not reduced blood volume. But again, the physicians weren't trying to harm anyone. They genuinely believed they were restoring balance. Medicine advances through centuries of correcting sincere mistakes. This was one of them. Leeches became particularly popular. These small creatures quietly attached themselves to skin and fed until full. A surprisingly peaceful career, all things considered. Modern medicine still uses medicinal leeches in certain specialized surgeries to improve blood circulation. So the humble leech has enjoyed one of history's most unexpected professional comebacks. Not exactly the career path anyone predicted. Then there were poultices. A poultice was essentially a soft mixture of herbs, bread, clay, or other ingredients placed directly on the skin. If someone developed swollen lymph nodes, doctors often applied warm poultices in hopes of drawing illness outward. The scientific explanation was incorrect. But warm compresses sometimes eased pain. Again, medieval medicine occasionally stumbled into genuine comfort measures. Honey deserves special mention. Many healers used honey on wounds. Not because they understood bacteria. Because experience taught them wounds often healed better with honey than without it. Modern research has confirmed honey possesses antibacterial properties. Ancient observation. Modern explanation. Sometimes history waits centuries for science to catch up. Vinegar also became extremely popular. People cleaned surfaces with it. Washed hands. Soaked cloths. Wiped furniture. Mixed it into various treatments. Vinegar does have some antimicrobial qualities. Not enough to stop plague completely. But certainly more useful than many alternatives available at the time. Even doctors recommended carrying vinegar-soaked sponges. Pleasant? Probably not. Helpful? Somewhat. At least compared to doing absolutely nothing. Another common recommendation involved avoiding excessive food. Heavy meals were believed to weaken the body. Patients often received lighter diets. Broths. Bread. Simple vegetables. Fresh fruit when available. Ironically, eating modest meals during severe illness isn't necessarily terrible advice. The reasoning differed. The result occasionally aligned with modern practice. People also paid close attention to sleep. Rest was considered essential. No medieval physician would have explained immune function the way modern medicine does. But they recognized exhausted people recovered poorly. Observation once again pointed them toward wisdom. Sometimes you don't need microscopes. You simply need generations of careful watching. Unfortunately, not every treatment proved so gentle. Some healers recommended rubbing strange substances onto swollen glands. Others advise drinking mixtures that sound less like medicine and more like unfortunate cooking accidents. Ground gemstones occasionally appeared. Animal products. Burned plants. Exotic spices costing fortunes. When fear grows large enough, almost any remedy begins sounding reasonable. Especially if someone claims their cousin's neighbor recovered after trying it. Medical misinformation, it turns out, is not a modern invention. The Middle Ages simply lacked social media to spread it quite as efficiently. Although wandering merchants came surprisingly close. Astrology remained deeply connected to medicine. Doctors consulted the stars before beginning treatments. Certain days were believed more favorable. The position of Mars mattered. The moon mattered. The zodiac mattered. Medical calendars carefully marked lucky and unlucky moments. To modern readers, this seems unusual. Yet remember, astronomy and astrology had not yet fully separated. Studying the heavens represented serious scholarship. The conclusions simply wandered into imaginative territory. Hospitals also existed, though they looked very different from modern ones. Many were operated by religious communities. These institutions focused less on advanced treatment and more on care. Food. Warm beds. Prayer. Basic nursing. Clean clothing. Someone sitting beside you during illness. Compassion itself became part of medicine. Even today, supportive care saves lives. A patient who remains hydrated, warm, nourished, and comforted often has better odds than one left completely alone. The medieval hospital understood this instinctively. Nurses, though rarely called by that modern title, played extraordinary roles. They changed bedding, prepared meals, washed patients, offered water, held frightened hands. They possessed little ability to cure plague, but tremendous ability to reduce suffering. History often celebrates famous physicians. It should also remember quiet caregivers whose names disappeared long ago. Without them, survival rates would almost certainly have been even lower. Families became nurses as well. Parents cared for children. Children cared for aging parents. Husbands cared for wives. Wives cared for husbands. Sometimes entire households became sick together. Sometimes one healthy family member somehow managed to care for everyone else. Those individuals displayed astonishing courage. Imagine entering room after room, day after day, knowing illness surrounded you. Not because someone ordered you. Because the people inside were your family. Love has always been stronger than fear. Not always, but often enough to change history. One practical habit slowly became more common. Cleaning clothing. People noticed garments worn around sick individuals sometimes seemed suspicious. Without understanding fleas or bacteria, they began washing fabrics more frequently when possible. Boiling clothes. Hanging them outdoors. Beating dust from blankets. Fresh air and sunlight accomplished more than anyone realized. Ultraviolet light, of course, remained completely unknown. The sun simply appeared healthy. Sometimes instinct makes excellent decisions. Fresh bedding became especially valuable. Changing linens helped reduce pests. It improved comfort. It created cleaner living spaces. Simple actions. Meaningful effects. Some communities also improved waste disposal. Garbage moved farther from homes. Animal remains were buried more carefully. Streets were cleaned with greater urgency. Again, the motivation centered on bad smells rather than microbes. Yet cleaner environments often reduced other diseases as well. History contains many accidental victories. One fascinating profession emerged stronger during outbreaks. Apothecaries. These specialists prepared medicines. They stored herbs in jars. Measured powders. Mixed oils. Sold dried flowers, spices, syrups, and countless remedies. Walking into a medieval apothecary must have been an unforgettable experience. Shelves packed with mysterious containers. Bundles of herbs hanging from ceiling beams. The scent of rosemary mixing with cinnamon, lavender, garlic, vinegar, and dried mint. It probably smelled far better than the average medieval street. Customers arrived carrying desperate questions. What should I give my husband? My daughter has a fever. My neighbor swears this herb works. The apothecary listened. Measured ingredients carefully. Offered advice. Sometimes wisely. Sometimes not. But always trying. No one possessed perfect answers. That uncertainty united everyone. Doctors. Priests. Kings. Peasants. Rich merchants. Poor laborers. The plague cared remarkably little about social status. Although wealth certainly improved access to food, cleaner housing, and opportunities to flee crowded cities. As weeks became months, something subtle changed. People started comparing notes. This family survived. That household isolated themselves. These neighbors burned bedding. Those people avoided crowded markets. Patterns slowly emerged. No scientific journal recorded these observations. No randomized clinical trial followed. Instead, knowledge traveled through conversation. One village copied another. Families remembered what seemed useful. Grandparents taught grandchildren. Practical wisdom accumulated one quiet story at a time. That slow sharing of experience may have saved more lives than any miracle cure ever claimed to. Because while medieval medicine could not defeat the Black Death, medieval people were learning. Watching. Adapting. Improvising. They were unknowingly laying the foundations of public health. Not through brilliant discoveries, but through thousands of careful observations made by ordinary people who simply wanted to see another spring. When we left our story, medieval doctors were carefully mixing herbs, families were hanging fresh linens in the sunlight, and apothecaries were doing their absolute best to invent medicines from whatever nature happened to provide. Nobody had discovered bacteria. Nobody knew about fleas. Nobody could explain exactly why one street suffered while another seemed strangely untouched. And yet, something interesting was beginning to happen. People were paying attention. Not in the scientific sense that we would recognize today. There were no laboratories filled with glass flasks. No researchers comparing infection rates with colorful charts. No carefully controlled experiments. Instead, there were conversations. Quiet ones. A farmer mentioning that a neighboring village had closed its gates. A merchant complaining that another city refused to let his wagon enter. A priest noticing that fewer people became sick in places where crowds had disappeared. Little observations. One at a time. History often celebrates great discoveries made by famous individuals. But sometimes progress arrives much more quietly. Sometimes it begins with ordinary people saying, you know, I think this actually helps. Tonight, let's stroll through the towns and cities of plague-stricken Europe and see how entire communities, armed with almost no scientific knowledge, slowly invented some of the earliest forms of public health. Not because they understood disease. Because they understood patterns. And human beings are remarkably good at noticing patterns. Even when we don't fully understand them. Imagine arriving at a medieval town sometime during the worst years of the Black Death. The first thing you would notice is the silence. Medieval towns were normally busy places. Merchants shouted prices. Blacksmiths hammered iron. Children chased each other through narrow streets. Dogs wandered wherever dogs pleased, which, judging by history, was absolutely everywhere. Church bells marked the hours. Market squares buzzed with conversation. The air was full of movement. Now, much of that movement had slowed. Many market stalls stood empty. Not because people no longer needed food. Because fewer people felt comfortable gathering together. Some merchants stayed home. Others had become ill. Some travelers simply decided that this particular town looked like somewhere they did not wish to spend the afternoon. A perfectly understandable decision. The roads themselves began changing. Travel had always connected medieval Europe. Pilgrims journeyed between shrines. Students traveled to universities. Merchants crossed kingdoms carrying wool, spices, wine, salt, and cloth. Messengers rode between castles. Life depended upon movement. But movement had acquired a frightening new reputation. Every traveler became a question. Where have you been? Who have you met? Has sickness appeared there? No one asked these questions casually anymore. The answers mattered. Some towns appointed guards at their gates. These men had an unusual responsibility. Not defending against armies. Defending against uncertainty. Visitors might be questioned. Where did you come from? How long have you been traveling? Has your village remained healthy? Of course. There was one obvious problem. Travelers did not always know. Someone could feel perfectly healthy while unknowingly carrying infection. Modern readers understand this immediately. Medieval gatekeepers did not. Still, asking questions proved better than asking none. Occasionally, someone admitted that disease had appeared back home. The gates remained closed. Harsh? Perhaps. But desperate times tend to produce difficult choices. Some communities became remarkably strict. Entire roads were blocked with wooden barriers. Bridges closed. River crossings were watched. Visitors found themselves politely, or sometimes not so politely, encouraged to continue somewhere else. Imagine walking for several days only to arrive at a town whose guards calmly informed you that absolutely nobody was entering today. It must have been frustrating. It may also have saved lives. Cities with ports faced even greater challenges. Trade could not simply stop forever. Without regular shipments, food shortages quickly followed. So port officials searched for compromise. Ships arriving from distant regions often remained anchored offshore. Crews waited. Cargo stayed aboard. Days passed. Then more days. Eventually weeks. This waiting period gradually evolved into one of history's most important health measures. Quarantine. Although the exact number of waiting days varied from place to place, the principle remained surprisingly modern. If illness appeared after arrival, better for it to happen away from everyone else. Without understanding microbes, officials had stumbled upon a genuinely effective strategy. One of the earliest examples of organized disease prevention. Not perfect, but remarkably clever. Venice became especially famous for refining this approach. As one of Europe's busiest trading centers, Venetian leaders understood something important. Trade created prosperity. Trade also created risk. Finding balance required careful planning. Special isolation stations eventually appeared on islands outside the main city. Travelers stayed there before entering Venice itself. Goods were inspected. Ships waited. Life slowed down. The inconvenience must have seemed enormous. But compared with uncontrolled outbreaks, waiting a few extra weeks suddenly looked like a bargain. Elsewhere, local governments issued new regulations. Some sound surprisingly familiar. Large festivals were postponed. Public celebrations quietly disappeared from calendars. Markets operated under restrictions. In certain places, weddings became smaller affairs. Funerals changed as well. Gathering hundreds of mourners suddenly seemed unwise. No one enjoyed these rules. People have rarely welcomed restrictions on daily life. That has remained one of humanity's most consistent personality traits. Still, necessity has a way of persuading even the most stubborn communities. Town councils suddenly found themselves making decisions unlike anything previous generations had faced. Should schools remain open? Well, most children learn through apprenticeships or church instruction rather than formal schools. Even so, education slowed. Should merchants continue traveling? Can fairs continue? What happens if farmers cannot reach markets? Each decision carried consequences. Protecting health often meant disrupting ordinary life. An uncomfortable balance that societies have wrestled with for centuries. One particularly interesting development involved record keeping. As outbreaks continued, some towns became much better at documenting deaths. Churches already kept parish records. Now these records acquired new importance. How many people had died? Which neighborhood suffered most? When did illness first appear? Nobody realized they were creating valuable historical documents. They simply wanted answers. Centuries later, historians would use these same records to reconstruct the spread of the Black Death. Sometimes the past leaves behind extraordinary clues without intending to. Sanitation also became a growing concern. Now, medieval cities were not sparkling examples of modern cleanliness. Streets often contained mud, animal waste, discarded food, and whatever else daily life happened to produce. But contrary to popular myths, people generally preferred cleaner surroundings whenever possible. Nobody actually enjoyed bad smells. During plague outbreaks, cleaning efforts intensified. Street sweepers worked more frequently. Waste was removed with greater urgency. Dead animals disappeared more quickly. Public wells received increased attention. Officials worried about foul odors. Remember the theory of miasma. Bad smells supposedly carried disease. So eliminating unpleasant odors seemed like sensible prevention. They misunderstood the mechanism. Yet cleaner environments still produced healthier communities overall. Not necessarily because plague vanished, but because many other illnesses also declined. History enjoys rewarding good habits for unexpected reasons. Some towns hired inspectors. Their job involved walking through neighborhoods looking for potential problems. Spoiled food. Blocked drainage. Overcrowded housing. Unsanitary conditions. Today we might call them health inspectors. Back then they simply represented practical local government. Not every inspection solved anything dramatic. Sometimes it merely encouraged people to tidy their surroundings. Small improvements accumulated. One street at a time. Fire also played an unexpected role. People frequently burned piles of herbs, branches, or aromatic woods in public spaces. The smoke drifted through narrow streets. Citizens believed it purified the air. Scientifically? Not exactly. Psychologically? Quite effective. Doing something often feels better than doing nothing. Communities desperately wanted action. Smoke became visible evidence that authorities were trying. Even if the actual benefits remained limited. Churches continued serving as community centers. Not only for worship. For information. Announcements. Support. Food distribution. Priests often became unofficial counselors. People asked frightening questions. Why is this happening? Will it ever end? How should we care for our families? No priest possessed perfect medical answers. But listening itself became valuable. Fear feels lighter when shared. Many monasteries opened their doors to travelers, the poor, and the sick despite enormous personal danger. Some monasteries lost heartbreaking numbers of monks. Others survived relatively well. Outcomes varied dramatically. Modern researchers believe factors like isolation, cleanliness, population density, and simple chance all influenced these differences. To medieval observers, it remained another mystery. One remarkable pattern slowly emerged. Communities that communicated effectively often responded more successfully. Imagine two neighboring villages. In one village, people ignore every warning. Visitors arrive freely. Markets remain crowded. Nobody changes routines. In the other village, local leaders encourage caution. Residents share information. Travel decreases. Families cooperate. Even without scientific understanding, the second village has quietly improved its odds. Coordination matters. It always has. Guilds played important roles too. These organizations represented craftsmen, blacksmiths, carpenters, bakers, tailors, masons. Each guild protected its members while helping regulate work. During plague years, guilds sometimes organized assistance for sick families. If a craftsman became ill, fellow members occasionally supported his household. Food arrived. Tools were protected. Children received help. Mutual aid has ancient roots. People survived disasters more successfully when they worked together. Not every act of survival involved medicine. Sometimes it involved bread, or firewood, or repairing someone's roof before winter arrived. Community itself became treatment. Of course, not everyone behaved generously. Fear has an unfortunate habit of revealing both humanity's finest and worst qualities. Some individuals fled immediately. Others abandoned neighbors. Merchants occasionally charged outrageous prices. Scammers sold miraculous cures guaranteed to work. History politely notes that miracle cures almost never deserve the word miracle. Then, as now, desperate people created opportunities for dishonest ones. Fortunately, generosity usually outnumbered greed. Ordinary families shared food. Neighbors checked on elderly residents. Children carried water for households under quarantine. Women prepared soup for those unable to cook. Tiny acts, repeated thousands of times. History often focuses on kings. It should spend more time celebrating anonymous kindness. One practical lesson spread almost everywhere. Crowding increased danger. People didn't understand exactly why. They simply noticed. Large gatherings often preceded more illness. So daily routines gradually adapted. Meetings happened outdoors when possible. Business became shorter. People kept a little more distance. Not 6 feet exactly. No one carried measuring sticks around medieval marketplaces. But space itself acquired new value. Fresh air became fashionable long before anyone could explain its benefits. Windows stayed open. Doors remained unlatched during daylight. Homes felt breezier. Again, miasma theory pointed people toward ventilation. The explanation failed. The habit occasionally succeeded. Rural villages generally experienced different challenges than crowded cities. Population density remained lower. Families spent more time outdoors. Homes stood farther apart. Fields naturally separated neighbors. These conditions sometimes slowed transmission. Not always. But often enough that country life appeared safer. This inspired another great migration. City dwellers with enough money fled to the countryside. Country estates suddenly filled with unexpected guests. Some villagers welcomed them. Others looked at these wealthy newcomers with understandable suspicion. After all, if you're escaping a city because disease is spreading, what exactly might you be bringing with you? Awkward conversations probably became quite common. Some villages simply refused entry. No exceptions. The local people had worked too hard protecting their community to risk everything for unexpected visitors. It sounds harsh. Yet from their perspective, it was an act of collective survival. Communication relied heavily on messengers. Letters traveled between towns. Monasteries exchanged news. Merchants carried stories alongside cargo. There's sickness in the north. The southern road appears safer. This town has closed its gates. Reliable information became incredibly valuable. Unfortunately, rumors traveled even faster. Someone heard that drinking enormous quantities of vinegar prevented illness. Another person insisted sleeping with onions under the bed offered protection. Someone else confidently declared that carrying a particular stone guaranteed safety. Human beings have always loved certainty. Even imaginary certainty. Sorting useful advice from hopeful speculation became another survival skill. By now, entire generations were learning painful lessons. Children watched adults change familiar routines. Young apprentices noticed fewer travelers. Farmers adapted planting schedules around labor shortages. Life itself began reorganizing. Not because anyone wanted change. Because survival demanded flexibility. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson these communities quietly taught history. They did not defeat the Black Death through one brilliant invention. They survived through adaptation. One small adjustment after another. Close the gate. Wash the clothes. Delay the market. Help the neighbors. Open the windows. Question the traveler. Record what happened. Learn from yesterday. Try again tomorrow. None of those actions seemed revolutionary by themselves. Together, they formed something remarkable. The earliest foundations of organized public health. Built not by modern scientists, but by ordinary medieval people doing their very best in a world that had suddenly become frighteningly uncertain. As our gentle journey continues, we'll leave the town gates behind and step inside the homes themselves, where parents, grandparents, children, and neighbors developed countless everyday routines that quietly increased their chances of seeing another harvest. Because surviving the Black Death wasn't only about cities making rules. It was also about what happened around the family table, one ordinary day at a time. By now, our journey has taken us through busy medieval ports, nervous town gates, smoky streets filled with burning herbs, and the surprisingly organized world of medieval physicians. Entire cities had begun inventing rules they hoped would slow the mysterious sickness. Merchants grumbled. Guards asked uncomfortable questions. Priests offered comfort where medicine could not. But tonight, let's leave the marketplaces behind. Walk away from the city walls. Turn down a narrow lane where chickens wander as if they personally own the road. A cat is sleeping on a windowsill, completely unconcerned with humanity's latest crisis. Somewhere nearby, someone is baking coarse brown bread, and the smell drifts gently through the evening air. History often remembers kings, bishops, generals, and famous doctors. Yet the Black Death was mostly experienced by people whose names we will never know. Farmers. Millers. Shepherds. Blacksmiths. Bakers. Weavers. Mothers rocking babies to sleep. Grandparents teaching children how to tend gardens. Teenagers wondering whether life would ever feel normal again. Their stories rarely appear in history books. Not because they were unimportant. Because ordinary lives usually leave behind fewer written records. Yet these ordinary families developed countless habits that quietly improved their chances of survival. Some of those habits came from careful observation. Others from tradition. Some from simple common sense. And a few from nothing more than stubborn hope. History, it turns out, has always depended upon stubborn hope. Imagine waking before sunrise in a small English village sometime around 1349. The rooster announces the morning with complete confidence, despite having no idea what day it actually is. Medieval roosters apparently considered themselves essential public servants. Inside a timber-framed cottage, the family begins to stir. The fire, carefully kept alive beneath ashes overnight, is coaxed back into life. A pot of porridge slowly warms. Someone fetches water. Someone else checks on the chickens. Life begins exactly as it always has. That routine mattered more than we often realize. Modern psychology tells us routines reduce stress during uncertain times. Medieval families didn't need psychologists to explain this. They simply knew that familiar work kept frightening thoughts from taking over. When everything outside feels unpredictable, sweeping the floor or kneading bread becomes strangely comforting. The world may be changing, but breakfast still needs cooking. Many households became far more cautious about visitors. Hospitality had always been one of medieval society's strongest values. Travelers were often welcomed. Neighbors wandered in and out freely. Doors rarely remained closed for long. The plague changed that. Families still valued kindness. They simply became more careful. If someone from another village arrived unexpectedly, conversations often happened outside. Food might be left on a bench rather than handed over directly. People hesitated before inviting strangers inside. No one enjoyed behaving this way. Communities depended on trust. But invisible danger has a habit of making people reconsider old customs. Some homes even created small routines for returning family members. Imagine a father coming home after visiting the weekly market. Before entering the main living area, he changes into cleaner clothes. His boots remain near the door. His hands and face are washed with water, sometimes mixed with vinegar. To him, this isn't about germs. It's about removing whatever unpleasant influence might have clung to him during his journey. Modern readers recognize something remarkable. Without understanding bacteria or fleas, many people were accidentally reducing risk. History is full of these quiet coincidences. Families also paid closer attention to their homes. Floors were swept more often. Dust was beaten from blankets. Mattresses stuffed with straw were occasionally replaced. Windows stayed open longer whenever weather allowed. Fresh air became almost a daily ritual. Of course, medieval windows were rather different from modern ones. Many homes had simple wooden shutters instead of glass. Opening the house meant letting in wind, sunlight, birdsong, and occasionally an overly curious chicken. Still, people believed fresh moving air carried health. The explanation was wrong. The habit often wasn't. Sunlight poured across wooden floors. No one knew ultraviolet light existed. They simply noticed homes felt cleaner after bright days. Sometimes experience arrived centuries before scientific vocabulary. Water also became more valuable than ever. Fetching water was already a major daily task. Most families carried buckets from wells, rivers, or springs. During outbreaks, many people tried harder to protect these water sources. Villages watched wells carefully. If a dead animal appeared nearby, it was removed quickly. People worried constantly about contamination. Some fears were misplaced. Others were surprisingly sensible. Clean water has always been one of humanity's greatest allies. Although they didn't know about microorganisms, medieval communities recognized that foul water often brought sickness. Experience had taught them that much. Food preparation changed too. Meals became simpler. Not because anyone suddenly preferred plain cooking. Because simpler food was easier to prepare during difficult times. Porridge. Vegetable stews. Fresh bread. Beans. Onions. Cabbage. Turnips. Whatever the season allowed. These foods weren't glamorous. They were dependable. Dependability has always been underrated. Families with small gardens gained an unexpected advantage. Growing herbs beside the house had long been common. Now those little gardens became miniature pharmacies. Sage. Thyme. Mint. Rosemary. Parsley. Chamomile. Garlic. Every plant seemed capable of helping something. Whether easing coughs, calming stomachs, improving sleep, or simply making plain food taste slightly less plain. Imagine a grandmother walking slowly through her herb garden. She knows exactly which leaves soothe a sore throat. Which flowers calm anxious children. Which roots should be dried for winter. She cannot explain chemistry. She doesn't need to. Knowledge passed from mother to daughter for generations had become a priceless resource. Many medieval women possessed extraordinary practical medical knowledge. History has not always given them enough credit. Laundry became another important task. Now, washing clothes in the Middle Ages required serious effort. Buckets had to be filled. Water heated. Soap prepared. Clothing scrubbed by hand. Then carried outside to dry. This wasn't a quick afternoon chore. It could consume an entire day. Yet during plague years, families often washed clothing more frequently whenever possible. Particularly garments worn while traveling or caring for sick relatives. Again, no one knew fleas might hide within fabric. Observation alone suggested cleaner clothing somehow seemed safer. Sometimes intuition quietly points toward truth. Sleeping arrangements occasionally changed. If someone developed a fever, families sometimes moved them into a separate corner of the house. Larger homes might dedicate another room. Smaller cottages used curtains or simple partitions. Privacy was limited. Distance itself became the goal. This wasn't isolation in the modern medical sense. But every little bit helped. Parents faced heartbreaking choices. Imagine caring for a sick child while trying to protect healthy brothers and sisters. No guidebook existed. No pediatric specialist could be consulted. Only instinct. Love. And hope. Those three companions have walked beside parents throughout all of history. Animals also required attention. Most families owned chickens. Some kept pigs. Others had goats or cows. Livestock represented wealth, food, and survival. Yet people gradually noticed that keeping animals inside crowded living spaces wasn't always ideal. During harsh winters, many animals traditionally shared buildings with humans for warmth. Some communities began separating them more often when possible. Not because they suspected animals spread plague exactly, but because cleaner homes generally felt healthier. Practical experience once again nudged society in useful directions. Children, meanwhile, continued being children. They played games. Collected sticks. Climbed trees. Chased dogs. Asked endless questions. Adults answered as honestly as they could. Which often meant admitting they simply didn't know. Why is everyone sick? We don't know. When will it stop? We don't know. Children have always deserved honest answers. Even when those answers are incomplete. Grandparents became living libraries. Their memories stretched back decades. Previous famines. Hard winters. Old illnesses. They reminded younger generations that difficult times eventually passed. That reassurance mattered enormously. Human beings need perspective during crises. Someone who has already survived one disaster tends to remain calmer during the next. Age brought experience. Experience brought steadiness. Evenings remained surprisingly peaceful. Without electric lights, most families gathered around the fire after sunset. Someone repaired clothing. Someone carved wood. Someone spun wool. Stories filled the room. Not every conversation centered on disease. People discussed harvests. Neighbors. Weather. Marriage plans. Children's mischief. Life insisted upon continuing. That determination may have been one of the greatest survival tools of all. Laughter did not disappear. Neither did birthdays. Nor weddings entirely. Communities simply celebrated more quietly. Hope often whispers instead of shouting. One fascinating habit involved scent. Homes frequently hung bundles of lavender, rosemary, juniper, or sweet herbs from ceiling beams. The pleasant aroma comforted families. Visitors noticed the fresh smell immediately. Modern science tells us certain herbs repel insects to a limited degree. Did medieval people know that? Not exactly. They believed fragrant air chased away disease. Different explanation. Occasionally similar result. Cats deserve a brief appearance in our story. For centuries, they had quietly hunted mice and rats around farms and villages. Some communities appreciated them enormously. Others, unfortunately, became suspicious during the plague years due to superstition. In a few places, cats were unfairly blamed alongside all sorts of imaginary causes. History owes cats a sincere apology. They were actually helping far more than hurting. The mice certainly weren't complaining about fewer cats. Well, perhaps they were. Just very briefly. Letters also connected families. If relatives lived in another town, messages traveled whenever possible. Simple updates became precious. We are still healthy. The harvest looks promising. Come only if necessary. Words carried comfort across uncertain distances. Not every letter arrived. Roads remained dangerous. Messengers fell ill. Still, people kept writing. Hope often travels by ink. Communal baking ovens continued operating in many villages. Rather than every household maintaining its own large oven, families often shared one. During outbreaks, people sometimes staggered baking times to reduce crowds. Again, tiny adjustments. Nothing dramatic. Just practical. One family arrives early. Another later. Everyone waits a little farther apart. Life adapts. Religious rituals became woven into everyday routines. Morning prayers. Evening prayers. Blessings before meals. Not because faith guaranteed protection. Because faith offered structure. When tomorrow feels uncertain, familiar rituals become anchors. Whether religious or otherwise, rituals remind people that some things remain constant. Many families also prepared for winter with greater determination than usual. Firewood was gathered earlier. Food preserved more carefully. Cellars organized. If illness struck during snow-covered months, leaving home became much harder. Preparation itself became another form of medicine. The better supplied a household remained, the less often family members needed to travel. Less travel meant fewer opportunities for exposure. No one planned it quite that scientifically. They simply wanted enough food until spring. One quiet hero appeared in nearly every village. The neighbor who checked on everyone else. Every community has one. The elderly widow who somehow knows exactly who needs soup. The blacksmith who repairs a broken cart without asking for payment. The baker who quietly leaves an extra loaf outside someone's door. These people rarely become famous. Yet disasters reveal their importance. History survives because ordinary kindness survives. Eventually, families developed something almost like confidence. Not confidence that they understood the plague. Far from it. Rather, confidence in their own ability to adapt. They had learned new routines. They knew which habits seemed helpful. They recognized warning signs earlier. Experience slowly replaced panic. That may sound like a small achievement. It wasn't. Remaining calm while facing uncertainty is one of humanity's greatest strengths. Generation after generation has relied upon it. As another evening settled over the medieval countryside, smoke rose gently from cottage chimneys. Bread cooled on wooden tables. Children drifted to sleep beneath wool blankets. Parents whispered about tomorrow's work. Outside, the stars shone exactly as they always had, completely indifferent to human worries. Inside those modest homes, however, something extraordinary was happening. Without universities. Without laboratories. Without modern medicine. Ordinary families were quietly inventing everyday habits that increased their chances of survival. Not through miracles. Not through magic. But through observation, cooperation, patience, and countless small acts of care repeated day after day. By now, we've wandered through frightened towns, stepped inside humble cottages, and watched ordinary families slowly adapt to a world that no longer felt predictable. We have seen doctors trying their best with herbs, vinegar, and centuries-old medical theories. We've watched city leaders invent early quarantine without realizing just how important that idea would become. But tonight, let's spend some time with the people who often stayed behind. Because whenever disaster visits humanity, something remarkable usually happens. Some people run away. Some people freeze. And some people quietly roll up their sleeves and ask the simplest question imaginable. Who still needs help? History remembers kings because they wear crowns. It remembers generals because they win battles. But disasters are often survived because of people whose names were never written down. The woman who carried soup to an elderly neighbor. The monk who stayed in an overcrowded monastery hospital. The village priest who continued visiting frightened families. The healer who spent another long night preparing herbal teas even while wondering if tomorrow would bring sickness to their own doorstep. These were not superheroes. They were simply ordinary people making extraordinarily difficult choices. So tonight, let's slow our pace even further and meet the quiet heroes of medieval Europe. Because while medicine was still centuries away from defeating plague, compassion was already highly developed. Imagine a monastery standing just outside a medieval town. Its stone walls have watched generations come and go. Gardens stretch neatly behind the buildings. Apple trees sway gently in the wind. A bell rings softly, calling the monks to prayer. Normally, monastery life follows a peaceful rhythm. Wake before sunrise. Pray. Work. Study. Pray again. Eat simple meals. Copy manuscripts. Tend gardens. Care for travelers. Then sleep. The days repeat themselves with comforting regularity. The plague changed everything. Monasteries had always welcomed strangers. Pilgrims arrived tired from long journeys. Poor families sought food. Travelers asked for shelter. The sick often came looking for help. Turning people away felt deeply wrong. Helping them carried enormous danger. Many monasteries faced an impossible choice. Close the gates and protect themselves. Or continue serving others. Different communities made different decisions. Many chose to remain open. Not because they believed themselves immune. Because they believed caring for others mattered even when the cost might be high. It is difficult to overstate how courageous that decision was. The monks had no vaccines. No antibiotics. No protective equipment beyond simple cloth robes. They washed patients. Prepared food. Changed bedding. Offered water. Read prayers beside frightened people who often feared they would never see another sunrise. Sometimes the monks survived. Sometimes they did not. Yet countless monasteries continued this work year after year. History rarely gives them enough attention. The same was true for convents. Across Europe, communities of nuns quietly became centers of care. Many women had extensive knowledge of herbs, nutrition, and nursing. Convent gardens were famous for medicinal plants. Lavender. Sage. Hyssop. Rosemary. Mint. Angelica. Chamomile. The sisters carefully cultivated these herbs long before the plague arrived. Now those gardens became even more valuable. Imagine one quiet afternoon. A nun walks slowly through the herb beds carrying a woven basket. She knows exactly which leaves to harvest. Not because she expects miracles. Because she hopes to ease someone's fever. Or calm an anxious patient enough to sleep for a few hours. Sometimes relief is the greatest gift available. Compassion often works in small ways. The medieval hospital looked very different from the hospitals we know today. There were no bright electric lights. No rows of advanced machines. No laboratory results arriving within minutes. Instead, picture a long hall. Wooden beds line the walls. Sunlight filters through narrow windows. The smell is a mixture of herbs, beeswax candles, fresh bread, and vinegar. Someone quietly recites prayers. Someone else changes clean linens. Another caregiver gently offers water to a patient too weak to ask. Modern medicine calls this supportive care. Keeping people comfortable. Providing food. Preventing dehydration. Offering warmth. Reducing loneliness. These things sound simple. They are not. Even today, supportive care saves countless lives. The medieval caregivers understood something timeless. You cannot always cure. You can always care. Village healers occupied another fascinating place in medieval society. Unlike university-trained physicians, many healers learned through experience. Knowledge passed from parent to child. Teacher to apprentice. Neighbor to neighbor. One generation quietly teaching the next. Which herbs eased pain? Which plants reduced swelling? Which teas encouraged sleep? Which roots settled upset stomachs? Many of these healers were women. Their expertise rarely appeared in official records. History often favored writing about educated men. Yet everyday medicine frequently depended upon knowledgeable women working inside ordinary homes. Without them, many communities would have faced even greater hardship. Not every remedy worked. Of course not. But many did enough to comfort patients. And comfort matters. Imagine a frightened child burning with fever. A warm cloth placed gently on the forehead. A soothing herbal drink. A familiar voice singing quietly beside the bed. None of these cure plague. Every one of them reduces suffering. Sometimes history measures success too narrowly. Survival is important. So is kindness. Priests also became constant companions during the Black Death. They baptized newborn babies. Blessed marriages. Comforted grieving families. Visited the sick. Listened to frightened confessions. Many spent hour after hour walking between homes. Their work changed dramatically. Normally, a priest celebrated joyful festivals throughout the year. Now much of his time involved quiet conversations. People asked questions no one could answer. Why is this happening? Will my children be safe? What happens if I don't survive? The priest often had no medical advice. Instead, he listened. Listening itself became a form of healing. Humans have always needed someone willing to sit beside them during difficult moments. One surprising group deserves recognition. The gravediggers. History rarely celebrates them. Yet someone had to perform one of the hardest jobs imaginable. They worked long days. Often quietly. Often anonymously. Many faced enormous personal risk. Without them, communities would have struggled even more. History sometimes depends upon people performing necessary tasks no one else wishes to do. Then there were the bell ringers. Church bells served many purposes. They marked time. Announced important events. Gathered communities. During plague years, the sound of bells became deeply emotional. Each ringing reminded listeners that another family needed support. Another funeral would quietly take place. Eventually, some communities rang bells less frequently. Not because they no longer cared. Because the constant sound became overwhelming. Silence itself began feeling kinder. Let's visit an apothecary once more. Business has never been busier. Customers arrive continuously. A worried father asks for herbs. An elderly woman seeks something to ease her cough. A monk requests fresh supplies for the monastery hospital. The apothecary measures dried plants with careful precision. Small paper packets are folded neatly. Glass jars line wooden shelves. Despite the constant demand, the apothecary knows an uncomfortable truth. Very few medicines actually stop the plague. Still, people leave carrying something. Perhaps herbs. Perhaps hope. Sometimes those two traveled together. Merchants occasionally surprised everyone. Rather than raising prices dramatically, some continued selling food at fair prices despite shortages. Not all merchants behaved generously. History contains plenty of examples of greed. But many recognize that communities survive together. If your neighbors starve today, tomorrow's marketplace becomes very quiet indeed. Practical kindness benefits everyone. Blacksmiths repaired tools without immediate payment. Millers continued grinding grain. Bakers rose before dawn every morning. Life's ordinary workers became essential. It is difficult to imagine history without them. Think about bread alone. Someone plants wheat. Someone harvests it. Someone carries it. Someone grinds it. Someone bakes it. During a plague, every step becomes harder. Yet every morning, fresh bread still appeared in countless villages. Civilization often survives because ordinary people simply keep doing their jobs. Teachers continued teaching whenever possible. Parents educated children at home. Older siblings helped younger ones learn prayers, reading, farming skills, or household tasks. Education slowed. It did not stop. Knowledge quietly continued moving forward. One conversation at a time. Animals also played unexpected roles. Oxen continued pulling plows. Horses carried supplies. Dogs guarded farms. Cats hunted rodents. Life stubbornly insisted upon continuing its usual routines. Nature rarely pauses for human disasters. The seasons certainly didn't. Spring arrived. Seeds required planting. Summer demanded harvesting. Autumn called for preparation. Winter expected firewood. No matter what illness troubled humanity, wheat still needed growing. Perhaps there is something comforting about that. The earth continues turning. The sun continues rising. Even history's darkest chapters contain ordinary mornings. As communities adapted, they became better organized. Healthy neighbors quietly checked on isolated households. Food appeared outside doors. Firewood stacks mysteriously grew larger overnight. People rarely asked who had delivered these gifts. Sometimes kindness works best anonymously. Imagine opening your front door one cold morning. A loaf of fresh bread waits outside. No note. No signature. Just bread. That simple act probably meant more than its unknown giver ever realized. The plague also transformed ideas about responsibility. People increasingly recognized that their own choices affected everyone else. Staying home while sick. Avoiding unnecessary travel. Helping vulnerable neighbors. These ideas seem familiar today. Their roots stretch surprisingly deep into medieval history. No one explained them using epidemiology. Communities simply learned through painful experience. One generation teaching the next. By now, children growing up during the plague had never known the old world. For them, washing carefully before meals, avoiding unnecessary crowds during outbreaks, and paying attention to community health simply became normal life. Entire cultures slowly changed. Not overnight. Generation by generation. One quiet lesson after another. Perhaps the greatest surprise is this. The Black Death did not only reveal humanity's weaknesses. It also revealed humanity's extraordinary resilience. Again and again, ordinary people chose cooperation over panic. Service over fear. Hope over despair. Not perfectly. Human beings have never been perfect. But often enough to matter. And that has always been enough to keep civilization moving forward. As the years slowly passed, something unexpected began happening. The plague still returned from time to time. But communities no longer faced it with complete confusion. They remembered. The old monk remembered which buildings worked best as hospitals. The village healer remembered which herbs eased suffering. The town council remembered the value of limiting travel. Parents remembered the importance of cleanliness. Children grew into adults carrying those memories with them. Knowledge accumulated. Slowly. Patiently. Quietly. That slow accumulation of experience would eventually shape the future of medicine, public health, and even the design of cities themselves. But before we reach that new world, we still have one final stretch of our journey. The worst years of the Black Death eventually began to fade. Not because humanity suddenly discovered a miracle cure. But because outbreaks burned themselves out, survivors rebuilt their communities, and Europe slowly learned how to live in a changed world. By now, we've spent many quiet evenings wandering through medieval villages, monastery gardens, crowded marketplaces, and simple family homes. We've watched ordinary people face one of history's greatest disasters with little more than observation, determination, and the hope that tomorrow might be slightly kinder than today. For years, life had been measured by uncertainty. Who would become ill? Which village would suffer next? Would the harvest be gathered? Would the merchant caravan arrive? Would your family still be together by winter? Questions like these became part of everyday life. But history has an interesting habit. Even the darkest chapters eventually begin to close. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. History almost never works that way. Instead, little by little, ordinary mornings began to feel ordinary again. The church bells still rang. The baker still rose before dawn. Children slowly returned to chasing one another through village streets. Someone repaired a broken fence. Someone complained about the weather. Someone argued over the price of sheep. Civilizations do not usually announce that they are recovering. They simply wake up one day and discover that normal life has quietly begun returning. And that is where our journey continues tonight. Imagine standing outside a small village sometime in the early 1350s. The fields are green once again. Wheat sways gently beneath the summer breeze. Birds chatter without the slightest concern for human history. Nature has an extraordinary ability to continue exactly as it always has. The plague has not disappeared completely. It never truly will. But the great wave that transformed Europe has finally begun to pass. The silence that once settled over many villages slowly starts to lift. Blacksmiths return to their forges. The familiar ringing of hammer against iron echoes across the morning air. Children pause to watch sparks leap from glowing metal. For the first time in years, the sound feels reassuring instead of ordinary. Sometimes you only appreciate familiar noises after they've disappeared. Markets begin filling again. Not immediately. Trust returns more slowly than trade. Merchants who once avoided certain roads cautiously venture back. Carts loaded with grain creak along dusty paths. Fishermen arrive carrying baskets of fresh catches. Potters arrange their clay bowls in neat rows. Tailors unfold bolts of wool. The market square slowly rediscovers its voice. It is not as crowded as before. Not yet. But it is alive. And after years of uncertainty, that feels like a remarkable achievement. Many villages, however, look noticeably different. Some cottages stand empty. Gardens have become overgrown. Wooden fences lean quietly after years without repairs. Fruit trees continue producing apples for families that are no longer there. There is something strangely peaceful about abandoned places. History leaves them behind as gentle reminders that time keeps moving. Survivors notice these empty homes immediately. Children ask questions. Parents answer carefully. Sometimes no words are needed. An empty doorway tells its own story. Yet people are remarkably adaptable. Before long, new families move into abandoned houses. Fields are reclaimed. Roofs repaired. Gardens planted once more. Life has always possessed an extraordinary talent for filling empty spaces. One unexpected consequence soon becomes impossible to ignore. There are fewer workers. Much fewer. For centuries, Europe had been filled with people competing for land, jobs, and opportunities. Now the balance has shifted. Suddenly, skilled workers become incredibly valuable. Imagine being a young carpenter before the plague. Finding steady work might have been difficult. Now, everyone seems to need a carpenter. Roofs require repairing. Doors need replacing. Furniture must be built. Entire villages are rebuilding. Your skills have become precious. The same is true for blacksmiths. Masons. Millers. Weavers. Farm laborers. People who once struggled to negotiate better wages suddenly find themselves in an unusual position. Landowners need workers more than workers need landowners. This quiet economic change transforms medieval society. Without anyone planning it. Without kings issuing grand announcements. Supply and demand simply begin rewriting history. Workers start asking for higher wages. Sometimes they receive them. Sometimes landowners refuse. Arguments become common. Not angry shouting matches. Just quiet negotiations. Will you harvest my fields? I will. For the usual payment? I'm afraid the usual payment no longer seems quite enough. One can almost imagine the awkward silence that followed. The laborer calmly waiting. The landowner realizing he has very few alternatives. Economics, it turns out, can be surprisingly persuasive. Governments notice these changes too. Some rulers attempt to freeze wages at older levels. They issue laws declaring what workers may earn. On paper, the rules appear straightforward. Reality proves considerably more complicated. If everyone needs blacksmiths, The blacksmith suddenly enjoys unexpected bargaining power. History politely reminds lawmakers that markets often possess minds of their own. Life inside villages slowly becomes healthier in subtle ways. With fewer people living in crowded spaces, homes become slightly less cramped. Families enjoy a little more room. Fields that were once farmed continuously are sometimes allowed to rest. Soil slowly recovers. Livestock gain better grazing land. Nobody sets out to improve agriculture intentionally. The improvements simply happen. History occasionally rewards humanity through unexpected side effects. Diet changes too. For many surviving families, food becomes slightly more plentiful. That may sound surprising after such enormous tragedy. But fewer people now share the same farmland. Meat appears on tables more often. Milk becomes easier to obtain. Fresh vegetables remain important. Bread still forms the center of most meals. Yet small improvements gradually appear. Better nutrition strengthens communities. Stronger communities recover more quickly. The cycle begins turning in humanity's favor once again. Monasteries quietly continue their work. Their libraries remain filled with carefully copied manuscripts. Monks preserve knowledge through patient handwriting. Hour after hour. Page after page. Imagine sitting beside a window while afternoon sunlight falls across a sheet of parchment. A monk slowly copies medical observations gathered during the plague. He does not know someone 600 years later may study those same words. He simply believes useful knowledge should not disappear. History owes an enormous debt to patient scribes. Without them, much of what we know about medieval life would have vanished. Doctors also begin asking different questions. For years they had relied almost entirely upon ancient authorities. Now experience has given them something new. Observation. Some physicians quietly admit that old books do not explain everything. Perhaps fresh ideas deserve consideration. This shift happens slowly. Very slowly. Scientific revolutions rarely begin with fireworks. They begin with thoughtful people saying, "Perhaps we should look again." That single sentence has changed history countless times. Apothecaries continue expanding their collections. New herbs arrive through trade. Different remedies are compared. Recipes are adjusted. Some ingredients quietly disappear after proving ineffective. Others remain popular because patients genuinely seem to benefit. Medicine inches forward. Not by giant leaps. By thousands of tiny steps. The plague also changes architecture in subtle ways. Some towns widen streets. New buildings include better ventilation. Hospitals become more organized. Water supplies receive greater attention. Waste disposal improves. Again, nobody speaks about bacteria. They simply remember what seemed to help. Collective memory quietly shapes the future. Travel gradually resumes. Pilgrims once again journey toward distant shrines. Students return to universities. Merchants cross mountains carrying cloth, salt, spices, and stories. Roads fill with conversation. Inns become lively. Ferries cross rivers carrying familiar cargo. Movement itself begins feeling hopeful again. Not every traveler carries fear. Many now carry opportunity. Families separated during the worst years finally reunite. Imagine two brothers embracing after months without news. Neither knows quite what to say. Sometimes silence communicates more than words ever could. Letters become treasured possessions. Communities celebrate simple reunions with quiet gratitude. There is no grand parade. Only relief. Children born after the worst years grow up hearing stories from parents and grandparents. Stories about empty streets. About brave neighbors. About monks who cared for the sick. About families sharing bread when food became scarce. These stories become part of local identity. Not told to frighten children. Told to remind them. Human beings survive together. That lesson echoes across generations. Religious life changes as well. Many people feel their faith deepen. Others quietly question old assumptions. Both responses are deeply human. Great disasters often reshape personal beliefs. Churches continue standing at the center of village life. Yet conversations become more thoughtful. People have witnessed too much to accept easy answers. Artists begin reflecting these experiences. Paintings include reminders of mortality. Poets write about the fragile nature of life. Musicians compose quieter pieces. Even architecture carries subtle reminders that earthly life remains uncertain. It might sound gloomy. Yet there is another way to see it. People begin appreciating ordinary days more deeply. When history reminds you how quickly life can change. An ordinary afternoon becomes something precious. A good harvest. Healthy children. Fresh bread cooling beside the fire. Rain arriving exactly when crops need it. Small blessings suddenly feel enormous. Perhaps they always were. The legal system slowly adapts too. Property changes hands. Land inheritance becomes complicated. Village records grow thicker as officials carefully document ownership. Lawyers remain employed. Some professions truly do survive everything. Universities also evolve. Medical schools begin collecting more observations. Scholars compare notes from different cities. Questions multiply. Why did one village suffer more than another? Why did some people recover? Why did certain practices seem helpful? The answers remain incomplete. But curiosity itself has become stronger. Curiosity is one of humanity's greatest survival tools. Eventually, travelers notice something remarkable. Europe has changed. Not only because millions have died. Because millions have learned. Communities communicate differently. Governments think differently. Doctors observe more carefully. Families value cleanliness more consistently. Cities organize themselves more thoughtfully. Well, here we are. We've traveled through frightened ports on the Mediterranean, walked beneath the stone gates of medieval cities, wandered into smoky cottages filled with drying herbs, spent quiet afternoons inside monastery gardens, and watched ordinary families do their very best to make sense of a disease they could not see and could not explain. For 6 parts, we've followed people who lived 670 years before antibiotics, vaccines, microscopes, ambulances, and hospitals filled with blinking machines. They had none of those things. Yet many of them survived. Not because they discovered a miracle cure. Not because someone suddenly understood bacteria. And certainly not because medieval medicine secretly knew everything modern science later discovered. No. They survived because human beings are remarkably adaptable. That may sound almost too simple. But history often is. When something doesn't work, people eventually stop doing it. When something seems to help, they repeat it. Generation after generation. Observation by observation. Small habit by small habit. Until one day those habits become tradition. And eventually, science arrives and explains why some of them actually worked. So tonight, as our long journey gently comes to an end, let's step back and look at the bigger picture. Because the story of surviving the Black Death is really the story of humanity itself. One of the greatest myths about the Middle Ages is that people simply accepted everything without thinking. That image couldn't be further from the truth. Medieval people were constantly observing. A farmer noticed which fields stayed healthier. A mother remembered which foods helped a feverish child drink a little more water. A monk compared notes with another monastery several days away. A merchant learned which cities had closed their gates. A village healer quietly remembered that honey seemed to help certain wounds heal. None of these people owned microscopes. But they owned something almost as valuable. Experience. Human civilization has always depended on experience. Long before universities existed. Long before scientific journals. Long before laboratories. Knowledge traveled by conversation. By memory. By grandparents sitting beside evening fires. Imagine an old woman sitting outside her cottage one summer evening. Her grandchildren gather around her. She tells them about the terrible years when entire villages fell silent. But she doesn't only speak about fear. She tells them what helped. Keep your home clean. Wash whenever you can. Don't ignore sickness. Help your neighbors. Fresh air is good. Take care of one another. The children nod. Years later, they teach their own children. That is how civilizations remember. Not every lesson requires a textbook. Some simply become part of everyday life. One fascinating change involved cleanliness. Now, modern movies often enjoy portraying medieval Europe as permanently filthy. Everyone covered in mud. Nobody ever washing. Cities apparently existing beneath one enormous cloud of unpleasant smells. Reality was considerably more complicated. Were medieval sanitation systems perfect? Not remotely. Did people value cleanliness? Very much so. The plague strengthened that belief. Communities became more interested in cleaner streets. Better water. Improved waste removal. Fresh clothing. Ventilation. Not because they suddenly discovered germs. Because generations of experience suggested cleaner environments usually produced healthier people. Sometimes practice arrives centuries before explanation. Hospitals also slowly changed. The medieval hospital had mostly been a place of care. Over time, it became increasingly organized. Patients could be separated more effectively. Buildings were designed more thoughtfully. Caregivers developed routines. Medical records slowly improved. Again, progress came quietly. History almost never announces. Congratulations. Medical science has advanced. Instead, someone rearranges the beds. Someone writes better notes. Someone asks one more useful question than yesterday. And after enough centuries, everything looks completely different. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Black Death was not a particular medicine. It was observation. Before the plague, ancient authorities often carried enormous influence. If Galen had written something over 1,000 years earlier, many physicians accepted it without much debate. After living through repeated epidemics, doctors slowly became more willing to compare old books with real life. Sometimes the books were right. Sometimes they weren't. Reality became another teacher. Science begins whenever observation becomes more important than assumption. That transition takes time. Lots of time. Europe would wait centuries before microscopes revealed bacteria. But the habit of questioning had already begun. Another unexpected lesson involved governments. Before the plague, many rulers focused primarily on taxes, wars, roads, and keeping neighboring kingdoms from becoming too enthusiastic about invading. Public health wasn't really considered a government responsibility. The plague changed that. Suddenly, city councils organized quarantines. Officials inspected neighborhoods. Records were kept. Travel restrictions appeared. Health became something communities managed together. That idea has never completely disappeared. Today, public health departments exist in nearly every country. Their roots stretch surprisingly far back into medieval Europe. Not because medieval officials understood infectious diseases. Because they understood responsibility. If protecting the community required cooperation, then cooperation became part of government. One of history's quiet revolutions. The Black Death also transformed work. We've already seen how labor became more valuable. But the effects reached much further. People began changing professions more easily. Some inherited land they never expected to own. Others moved to growing towns. Apprentices became master craftsmen sooner than previous generations. Entire social classes shifted. For centuries, medieval society had often seemed fixed. The plague reminded everyone that history enjoys rearranging expectations. Very few people wake up expecting to live through an event that changes civilization. Yet millions did. And afterward, nothing was exactly the same. Universities changed too. Medical education slowly expanded. Scholars translated additional texts. Ideas traveled farther. Curiosity increased. The great scientific revolution still lay far in the future. But every great journey begins with small steps. Someone asks, "What if we've misunderstood something?" Someone else replies, "Let's find out." That conversation has probably advanced civilization more than any other. The plague also quietly encouraged record keeping. Churches documented births and deaths more carefully. Cities recorded outbreaks. Officials tracked supplies. Merchants kept better business records. Historians today rely heavily upon those documents. Ironically, people trying to survive the present unknowingly preserved the past for us. Without their careful writing, much of this story would have disappeared forever. Then there is the question everyone eventually asks. Could people actually survive the Black Death without modern medicine? The answer is yes. Many did. Not because medieval medicine cured plague. It generally could not. But because survival depends upon many things. Some people possessed stronger immune systems. Some experienced less exposure. Some benefited from simple luck. Others received good nursing care. Some lived in less crowded places. Some remained well-nourished. Some communities organized themselves effectively. There was no single reason. History rarely offers single reasons. It usually hands us dozens of small ones instead. That complexity is important. Human beings often search for one dramatic explanation. One magical answer. One secret. The real world usually responds. I'm afraid it's a little more complicated than that. And somehow, that's comforting. Because it reminds us that small actions matter. A clean home. A supportive neighbor. Fresh food. Rest. Observation. Community. None of these alone stopped the Black Death. Together, they improved countless lives. Let's take one final walk through our little medieval village. Morning sunlight falls across fields ready for harvest. The village blacksmith is already working. His apprentice pumps the bellows while sparks leap cheerfully into the air. The baker removes fresh loaves from a stone oven. The smell drifts lazily through narrow streets. Children race after a stubborn goose that clearly has no intention of cooperating. Some things never change. A grandmother steps into her herb garden. She clips a little sage. Some rosemary. A handful of mint. Not because plague is everywhere. Simply because families still get headaches. Children still catch colds. Life continues requiring small acts of care. Nearby, church bells ring gently across the countryside. Not as warnings anymore. Just marking another ordinary hour. After everything these people endured, ordinary has become something beautiful. Farmers head toward the fields carrying simple wooden tools. They stop to speak with neighbors. Someone laughs. Someone shares bread. Someone complains that the weather has once again failed to consult them before changing. Humanity, thankfully, remains wonderfully consistent. A traveling merchant enters the village. This time, nobody panics. The gate opens. Questions are still asked. Old habits remain. Experience has left its mark. But fear no longer controls every conversation. Children who were born after the worst years know the Black Death only through stories. To them, it sounds almost unbelievable. A world where entire cities fell silent. Where travelers waited outside ports for weeks. Where families burned fragrant herbs every evening. Where vinegar became almost everyone's favorite cleaning solution. History often feels unreal to those who did not experience it. That is one reason stories matter. They preserve memory after memory itself begins fading. Centuries pass. Kingdoms rise. Kingdoms fall. New diseases appear. New medicines are discovered. The microscope reveals an invisible universe. Scientists identify bacteria. Doctors develop antibiotics. Vaccines save millions of lives. Hospitals become places medieval physicians could scarcely imagine. Yet even now, some of the oldest lessons remain surprisingly familiar. Wash your hands. Keep clean water. Care for the sick. Pay attention to patterns. Share reliable information. Protect your community. Help your neighbors. Support caregivers. Value observation. Those ideas feel modern. Many of them became deeply rooted during the centuries that followed the Black Death. History has a quiet way of passing wisdom from one generation to the next. Sometimes through books. Sometimes through traditions. Sometimes through grandparents who simply say, "This is how we've always done it." And often, they don't realize how old that wisdom really is. As our journey finally reaches its end, the medieval village slowly disappears into the evening mist. The smoke from its chimneys rises peacefully into a sky that has watched every chapter of human history. The fields grow quiet. The church bell rings one final time. The blacksmith closes his workshop. The baker sweeps flour from the wooden table. Children drift toward their homes as the last light fades across the hills. Inside each cottage, candles flicker softly against timber walls. Families gather around simple meals. Someone tells an old story. Someone mends a shirt. Someone quietly thanks God for another peaceful day. It is, in every way, an ordinary evening. And perhaps that is the greatest victory of all. Not defeating death forever. Humanity has never managed that. Not discovering a magical cure overnight. History rarely grants such gifts. The true victory was something quieter. People endured. They adapted. They learned. They cared for one another even when answers were scarce. They passed those lessons to their children. And those children passed them to theirs. Across centuries, through countless ordinary lives, humanity slowly built the world we know today. So the next time you wash your hands without thinking, or open a window to let fresh air inside, or visit a doctor whose knowledge rests upon generations of observation, you are, in a very small way, benefiting from lessons first learned by ordinary people who faced extraordinary times. People who survived not because they understood everything, but because they never stopped learning. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through one of history's most challenging chapters. Now the village is asleep. The fire has burned low. The stars shine quietly overhead, just as they did in the year 1350. And with that peaceful medieval night settling across the countryside, it's time for us to quietly close the door, let the candles fade, and wish our patient travelers a very restful good night.